Hey guys, tonight we slip barefoot into the wet, overgrown heart of ancient Tenochtitlan. The moon hangs low like a voyeur above obsidian-roofed gardens, and something moves in the reeds. You breathe in damp soil, crushed marigold, and the faint musk of sweat, perfumed with cacao oil and crushed rosewood. You're not supposed to be here. Not in this part of the palace. Not at this hour. But here you are, following the soft slosh of footsteps through a midnight orchard thick with flowered archways and silk-draped trellises. Somewhere nearby, someone is laughing, quietly, breathlessly, and not alone. A jaguar statue stares at you with its jade eyes. From its mouth, water trickles, cool and constant, into a carved basin where lovers once bathed under starlight. And just beyond the statue, half hidden by night-blooming cereus, there's a tiled bench still warm with the memory of thighs and whispers. You've stumbled into the Aztec love gardens, the forbidden ones, where emperors met mistresses in the fog of night, where nightbirds sang in secret codes, and where desire, for once, wasn't a sin but a ceremony. You probably won't survive this place. Not if the wrong priest catches you. Not if a noble's jealous lover spots your silhouette. And definitely not if you drink the wrong flower tea. But you came anyway, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with your city and what time you're listening. Let's map this sleepless garden together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move slowly now, your sandals slick with dew, as the air thickens, not just with humidity, but with tension. These gardens weren't innocent. Nothing planted here was just ornamental. The Aztecs didn't believe in casual landscaping. Every petal was political, every scent a signal. In these quiet groves, hidden behind the palace walls and hemmed with lava stone fountains, the elite enacted their love lives with the same precision they used in war. But love in this empire was not just private pleasure. It was theology, economy, espionage, and sometimes execution. Historians still argue whether these erotic gardens were modeled after mythical realms or simply the imperial version of a hot tub date. But we know they were real. Their remains whisper beneath Mexico City's foundations. Montezuma's private flower court, they say, sprawled across acres, fed by aqueducts that brought in mountain water, and guarded by eunuchs trained more in discretion than warfare. And as you walk deeper, the branches begin to arch lower, the air warmer, the sounds more intimate. The rustling isn't just leaves. Somewhere ahead, two bodies collide in a kiss sharp enough to tear history. Here, under moonlight, the rules shifted. You didn't seduce with glances but with metaphors. You didn't ask someone to dance, you sang them a riddle laced with double meanings. The language of love here, nahuatl, was dripping in symbol. To say, "You're beautiful," was to say, "You are like the first flower after the dry season." And to say, "I want you," was more like whispering, "I offer my heart like a cacao pod in full bloom." No pressure, right? Still, behind the charm and the verse, there was power. And nothing revealed this more than Montezuma's infamous garden rituals. The emperor was said to have strolled through these flowered halls daily, selecting not just plants but people, acolytes and dancers, poets and courtesans, each trained to embody a specific emotion or aesthetic. There was a girl whose hair smelled always of cinnamon, a boy who wept beautifully on command, a musician who only played at twilight. They weren't lovers in the modern sense. They were curated experiences, living metaphors. You didn't just fall in love here, you fell into a carefully designed story. Of course, this wasn't all tender music and metaphor. Some nights, the gardens hosted more charged events. Whispers of sacred orgies have survived in the form of colonial horror stories. Exaggerated, maybe, but not entirely fiction. One Spanish friar claimed to have seen the devil himself in peacock feathers dancing among naked priests. Was it true? Or was it a colonial projection fueled by terror and wet dreams? Historians still debate it. But someone was definitely dancing. And someone was definitely watching. Sex, for the Aztecs, wasn't just biological. It was cosmological. To unite with someone was to reenact the union of gods. One of the oldest Aztec myths describes Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, descending into the underworld to gather bones, and having to seduce death herself to do it. He sings to her, flatters her with poetry, promises renewal. They don't kiss exactly, but something intimate passes between them, and from that moment life. Desire wasn't just a distraction from duty. It was the duty. Even the gardens reflected this. Every plant had symbolic weight. Xochitl, the flower, was a word also used for pleasure, for poetry, and for ephemeral beauty. The Aztecs believed that to pluck a flower was to accept death, because beauty and death were lovers too. That's why, in many romantic rituals, the offering of a flower was both a seduction and a farewell. Take this, it said, and know you'll never be the same. Pretty romantic, until you realize that sometimes the flower in question was a hallucinogenic, one that made you see your ancestors tap dancing in obsidian masks. Which brings us to tonight's first sex story. Don't worry, it's PG-13, sort of. In the codices, there's an account of a noblewoman known only as the Flower Priestess. She was rumored to have been chosen at 14 for her voice like wind through reeds. By 17, she wasn't just leading chants, she was advising generals. But behind the chants, she had lovers, many of them. Her favorite? A captured enemy prince with mismatched eyes. She taught him the erotic poems of her people. He taught her how to fight with an obsidian-bladed club. They met secretly in the steam gardens. They covered their bodies in petals to mask their scent. Their affair lasted 2 years until he was sacrificed. She didn't cry. She just walked into the garden that night and sang until dawn, barefoot and naked, while the flowers bloomed wildly around her. What's strange is that even in the driest records, even the Spanish ones, the memory of the flower priestess lingers like perfume. Historians can't agree if she was a real person or a metaphor. Maybe she was both. In Aztec worldview, the line between symbol and skin was thin. Everything stood for something else, and sometimes someone else. That's what made love here so dangerous. You never knew if the kiss was for you ... or for what you represented ... And just as you settle into that idea, a night bird calls out above. Not a regular bird. This one mimics sounds it hears: moans, whispers, coughs. The Aztecs believed these birds were sacred spies. They nested near garden groves, learned your secrets, and carried them to the gods. Or your enemies. Depending on who paid better. A fringe belief? Sure. But there are records of nobles feeding night birds aphrodisiac seeds and training them to repeat courtship phrases. Imagine your flirty text being repeated by a parrot to your rival. Rough, but that's the thing about this place. Even the wildlife was weaponized. Even love songs had spies. Even your tears, if shed in the right moon phase, could be turned into a love spell or a curse. You step carefully now. The grass is damp, yes, but also sacred. It remembers things. The earth here has swallowed too many secrets to be trusted. And as the garden curls around you like a lover's arm, one thing becomes clear. This wasn't a place for innocent crushes. It was an empire of metaphor, a world where every gesture, every glance, every scent was loaded. Desire wasn't a side story, it was the strategy. It made alliances, broke treaties, wrote poems, drove sacrifices, built gardens. And if you think this night is strange, well, we've only just begun. You duck beneath a curtain of hanging orchids, their petals trembling with the memory of footsteps, and emerge into a clearing where the air is slick with rain from earlier in the evening. The stones are still steaming. You move carefully now, not because you're afraid, but because you're starting to understand. This isn't just a garden, it's a stage. Every tree, every vine, every pond here plays a part in a drama older than conquest and more dangerous than war. And if you want to survive the next act, you'd better learn the language. Not Spanish, not English, not even Nahuatl in the academic sense. No, the true language of this place is metaphor, and flirtation is its dialect. The Aztecs didn't ask you out. They serenaded your ancestors. They didn't compliment your looks. They invoked the spirits of spring and hinted that your face reminded them of the sunrise after a particularly brutal rainy season. Courtship was spiritual espionage. A conversation that happened sideways, in riddles, with plausible deniability. You weren't supposed to admit you were flirting. You were supposed to hope the other person understood you were metaphorically offering them your petal, whatever that meant. And if they misunderstood, if your poetic overture was taken the wrong way, that could mean disgrace, or exile, or a public beating by an angry brother. But hey, worth it for true love, right? This poetic tension is part of what made Aztec flirting so compelling. It wasn't casual, it was dangerous, especially because so much of it took place in front of witnesses. The courtship process often happened in public during festivals, dances, or religious observances. You'd lock eyes across a flower-strewn courtyard during the Feast of the Dead, pass a marigold to your crush beneath a mask of incense, and hope the gesture wasn't intercepted by. The Aztec understanding of desire wasn't just between two people. It was triangular, always involving the divine. To flirt was to invite the gods into your conversation. You weren't just seducing someone, you were reenacting celestial events. The gods had their own messy love stories, and humans were expected to echo them, respectfully. Take Xochiquetzal, goddess of beauty, love, and female sexuality. She was married to Tlaloc, the rain god, but kidnapped by Tezcatlipoca, the god of night and sorcery. She was both a victim and a symbol of erotic agency, her body the battlefield of divine conflict. When lovers invoked her name, they weren't just hoping for attraction, they were risking divine entanglement. Some even claimed her spirit would possess particularly attractive women during festivals, making them irresistible. Was it belief? Or a convenient excuse for flirting with your cousin's wife? Historians still argue whether the invocation of love deities in courtship rituals was meant literally or performed theatrically. But either way, the emotional effect was real. Lovers prayed before they flirted. They consulted omens. They carried talismans. One popular token was a carved obsidian mirror said to show you the face of your destined beloved. And if it showed your own reflection, bad omen. Better hope you weren't too invested. But not everyone followed the rules. There's a lesser-known tale of a flower vendor in Tlatelolco, a woman known for mixing sensual poems into her flower bundles. She sold roses to widows, orchids to newlyweds, and to those brave enough nightshade with coded notes. She called them love bundles, and legend says at least 3 noble marriages were brokered through her quiet business. But one day, she was caught accused of encouraging illicit affairs. Her punishment? Not death, but silence. Her tongue was ritually pierced and sewn for a moon cycle. When she returned, she never spoke again. But her flower bundles? They became even more popular. Because in a world of metaphor, silence is just another kind of poem. And here's your required quirky tidbit. Aztec courtship dances involved puppets. Yes, actual dolls. Men and women would manipulate puppets in miniature courtship scenarios, scripting their desire through proxy characters. It was both adorable and psychologically revealing. You could test your flirting strategy on a doll before trying it in real life. Picture a teenage boy mumbling sweet nothings through a tiny puppet made of corn husks. It's like ancient emotional rehearsal theater. or just dating with plausible deniability. As you walk past a bubbling spring, its surface glowing with faint reflections of torchlight, you start to realize how layered everything was. A glance could be a poem. A poem could be a proposal. A flower could be a trap. Every expression of interest carried weight, not just emotionally, but socially and spiritually. You weren't just risking rejection. You were risking reputation. You were risking cosmic imbalance. And yet, people kept doing it, because desire doesn't care about regulations. It pushes through the latticework. It grows up between the temple stones. It perfumes the air no matter how many priests try to fumigate it. And just before you leave the clearing, you hear it soft, almost imperceptible, the recitation of a love poem in Nahuatl, not from a person, but from the water. A trick of the breeze? Maybe, or maybe someone left their words here long ago, and the garden remembers. Maybe the stones are just repeating the lines that once made a priestess blush. Either way, you pause, you listen, and you understand now. The Aztecs didn't whisper, "I love you." They offered you their breath, their flowers, their metaphors. And if you returned the gesture, if you replied in kind, you weren't just accepting a flirtation. You were stepping into an ancient performance, one older than memory, and far more dangerous than it looked. You move deeper now, your fingers grazing the mossy wall of an ancient bathhouse, where steam once billowed out into the garden like dragon breath. This is where Montezuma, the emperor with more concubines than cousins, staged his botanical fever dreams. You step lightly, not out of respect, but because the stone beneath you has been smoothed by centuries of bare feet lovers, servants, priests, and spies, all drifting in and out of the emperor's pleasure compound. The walls are covered in carved vines. Real vines once crept through the cracks. And in the center of it all, the infamous floral chamber, Montezuma's private love greenhouse. Not just a garden, not just a bedroom. This was a living museum of seduction. A greenhouse where orchids bloomed out of skull-shaped pots and hummingbirds dipped their needle-thin beaks into ruby-colored nectar that wasn't always made from flowers. He didn't keep trophies. He kept fragrances. The emperor's collection of flowers and erotic perfumes was so extensive it required a rotating team of botanists, dancers, and animal handlers to maintain. There were birds trained to sing only. At dusk, frogs whose croaks had been bred to mimic flute tones, and a circle of dancers who wore nothing but translucent veils and rings of jasmine. It wasn't just indulgent, it was calculated. Montezuma weaponized beauty, and desire, under his rule, became a language of control. Historians still argue whether Montezuma's erotic gardens were inspired by Toltec traditions or a feverish response to political instability. But whatever their origin, they worked like propaganda. Imagine a visiting noble from a rival city-state, invited to tour the emperor's collection. First, he's greeted with a flower that only blooms once every 7 years, followed by a dancer who mimics the movements of a jaguar in heat. Then comes the tea brewed from a root that sharpens perception and slightly loosens your moral compass. By the time Montezuma appears, perfumed and barefoot, draped in hummingbird feathers, you're already halfway convinced that this empire runs on divine sensuality. The message was clear. Our power is not just in our armies, it's in our mastery of pleasure. And no one mastered it quite like Montezuma. He had lovers arranged by seasons. Spring for curiosity, summer for passion, autumn for melancholy, and winter for cold beauty. Each category had its own costume, music, perfume, and even speech cadence. You weren't just a concubine, you were an embodiment of a mood. Tonight's sex story belongs to a woman known in oral histories as La Voz de Viento, the voice of wind, chosen at the age of 16 for her ability to sing 4 octaves without drawing breath. She was assigned to Montezuma's twilight court, the group of courtesans who only performed between dusk and moonrise. Her role wasn't just singing. She was trained in aromatherapy, seduction rituals, dream interpretation, and the delicate art of turning rejection into flattery. Her job was to calm the emperor's anxieties through presence, not pressure. One night, while walking with him through the moon garden, she noticed his steps faltering. Instead of speaking, she picked a single flower, a ghost orchid, and gently touched it to his lips. Montezuma froze. Not because of the gesture, but because that particular flower had a legend, that anyone who kissed it would forget their deepest sorrow. He kissed it anyway. The next morning, he ordered her transferred, not to punishment, but to a new role, imperial consort. Her reward was not wealth but narrative. She became a story the court whispered about in poems, a figure who blurred the line between real woman and symbolic balm. What's fascinating is how much of this erotic performance was embedded in religious logic. Pleasure wasn't profane, it was divine mimicry. The gods desired, the gods mated. The gods betrayed each other and then reconciled with sensual offerings. So why wouldn't humans be expected to reenact the same cycles? Montezuma, ever the high priest of himself, didn't just collect lovers, he curated moments. He believed that the right blend of sound, scent, and story could align the soul with celestial patterns. And maybe he was right. Guests to his palace reported dreams more vivid than reality, sensations that lingered for days, and an eerie sense that they'd been touched by something not entirely mortal. But not everyone swooned. There were skeptics, warriors, and priests who saw the gardens as distractions, even dangers. One fringe sect of temple scribes reportedly kept logs of Montezuma's nightly visits, trying to decode patterns, suspecting political motivations behind romantic choices. Was he favoring one region over another? Was his affection for a dancer from Texcoco signaling alliance? Or was he simply bored? One such scribe, whose notes were discovered centuries later, wrote, "The emperor does not dream. He stages dreams for others to inhabit." That line has been quoted in countless papers since, though some historians suspect the whole log may have been apocryphal. Still, the phrase sticks, doesn't it? And here's your quirky tidbit for the night. Montezuma's garden also hosted an erotic aviary. Birds, dozens of species, were trained to perform mating dances not just for each other, but for human spectators. These weren't just cute distractions. They were metaphors made feathery. The most prized of these birds was the whisper jay, believed to be capable of echoing love confessions spoken under moonlight. According to legend, one of Montezuma's rivals was exposed when a whisper jay repeated his intimate secrets back to the emperor during a dinner. Coincidence? Trained mimicry? Or divine justice? Depends on who you ask. As you continue through the chamber, you spot a worn mural half lost to mildew and time. It shows a man and woman kneeling across from each other, palms pressed together, not in prayer, but in what looks like a mirrored embrace. Between them grows a single flower with two stems. The symbolism is clear. This was not a culture that separated love and politics, or sex and spirituality. Everything touched everything else. To know someone's scent was to know their soul. To memorize their love poem was to hold power over them. To dream of them in the right garden, under the right moon, could be more binding than a treaty. And it's important to remember, too, that these pleasures weren't equally accessible. While Montezuma curated his floral labyrinth, the average citizen might express their affection through simpler, quieter gestures, a necklace of seeds, a poem carved into a fruit rind, a shared bowl of pulque. But even then, metaphor reigned. A poorly chosen word could doom a budding romance. One lover famously wrote, "Your smile is like a jaguar's yawn." He meant dangerous and beautiful. She took it as boring and threatening. The relationship didn't last. Desire was a performance, and no one performed it better than the emperor. But as you exit the greenhouse, stepping past a half-collapsed stone arch and into the chill of night, you wonder, was Montezuma ever truly loved? Or was he just surrounded by excellent actors, playing out roles in a script he wrote, but could never leave? In a world where every affection was layered in ritual and metaphor, where did real emotion live, or did it? Maybe the point wasn't to feel deeply, but to feel correctly, to experience beauty the way a god might detached, curated, symbolic. You leave the garden, but its scent clings to your skin. The memory of orchids and whetstone follows you, like breath on the back of your neck. And just when you think the spell is lifting, you hear it again, that flutter of wings, that faint melody from a bird trained not to sing, but to remember. Something in you stirs, not fear, not desire, something older. Recognition. The garden may be gone, the emperor dust, but the language remains. And you've just begun to learn how to speak it. You hear it before you see it, a soft breath, a hush like silk sliding off skin. You follow the sound, and suddenly the garden narrows into a corridor of tall reeds and dripping vines, the air thick with heat and the smell of something earthy and forbidden. You've just stepped into the temple quarter, where the whispers get heavier and the shadows seem to lean in. This is where celibacy lived, not in peace, but in tension. It smells like candle wax and crushed basil, and somewhere nearby, someone is quietly crying. Or laughing, you can't tell. But this much is certain. Nothing about chastity here is simple. The temple virgins, those elusive figures of moral purity, were less saintly than you've been led to believe. They weren't cloistered nuns with spotless thoughts. They were political instruments, sacred performers, and sometimes elite pawns with sharp minds and sharper survival skills. The storybook said they lived untouched lives, behind gold-threaded curtains, spending their days weaving, praying, and occasionally interpreting omens. But the truth, more tangled. These girls were trained from childhood to embody divine femininity, not just spiritually, but physically. Their bodies weren't their own. They were the state's property, guarded and sometimes displayed like sacred relics. And their virginity? A symbol of cosmic balance. If one of them fell in love or worse, acted on it, it wasn't just scandal. It was seen as an existential threat. The kind of thing that made volcanoes erupt and crops fail. So yes, the stakes were high, but so was the temptation. Historians still argue whether the so-called temple virgins were entirely celibate, or whether the title itself was more symbolic, a label meant to ensure prestige rather than enforce behavior. But court records hint otherwise. One surviving fragment from a legal scroll details the trial of a high-ranking priestess caught in an illicit affair with a visiting ambassador. The punishment? Public shaving of her head, exile, and allegedly a quiet late-night drowning to preserve the honor of the temple. What happened to the ambassador? Nothing, of course. Because in Aztec society, female desire was a loaded weapon. Dangerous in the wrong hands, priceless in the right ones. Which brings us to tonight's sex story, or rather its scandal. A tale pulled from the margins of a Franciscan's journal scribbled hastily between dull accounts of maze rituals and census notes. It tells of a woman known only as She Who Dreams, a senior priestess in the House of Flowers. She was renowned not just for her prophetic dreams, but for her ability to calm thunder with song. Men feared her. Women whispered about her. She never spoke during the day, only at night during ritual. Chance did her voice bloom. And one night, during a lunar ceremony, a soldier from Tlaxcala caught her gaze. No words passed, but something did. Over the next 3 moons, he returned, always lingering at the temple's edge, always silent. Then, on the solstice, she vanished. 3 days later, they were found in the mist gardens naked, asleep, entwined beneath a stone statue of Coilzaqui, the dismembered moon goddess. They claimed the goddess had summoned them, that their union was divine. The high priests didn't buy it. The soldier was sacrificed. She was placed in isolation for the rest of her life, fed only water and poetry. But her legend endured. She became a symbol, not of shame, but of resistance. The woman who dared to turn chastity into choice, and what a choice it was. You have to understand, these virgins weren't simply avoiding temptation. They were steeped in it. Their daily lives were surrounded by rituals of fertility, incense baths, body painting, even the handling of sacred phallic relics during harvest festivals. All symbolic, of course. But symbols get heavy after a while. Especially when you're 16, covered in flower paste, chanting invocations to gods of reproduction, while pretending not to notice the young warriors outside rehearsing their dances. Shirtless and slick with ritual oil. Here's your quirky tidbit for tonight. Temple schools for girls, called kwikali sometimes, included lessons in how to reject advances with elegance. Yes, they practiced turning men down as a form of spiritual discipline. If your refusal didn't include at least 3 metaphors and a poetic allusion to frost on the mountaintop, you were sent back to revise it. There are documented cases where a girl's refusal was so artful, it ended up being set to music and sung at festivals. Imagine turning someone down so beautifully they write a song about it. Goals, but rejection wasn't always allowed. In some rare cases, temple virgins were ordered to accept dreams, a euphemism for spiritually sanctioned unions, often with high-ranking officials or even visiting deities in human disguise. These acts were cloaked in mysticism, framed as divine communion. But behind the incense and chants, politics, a ritual betting with a nobleman could forge alliances, bind regions, or neutralize potential threats. And when it was over, the virgin was either elevated or discarded. If she bore a child, the baby was often raised as a moonburn, a being of special fate, marked by stars and cursed with visions, and still they endured. Not because they were powerless, but because they learned to wield their silence like a knife. Many of these priestesses became advisors, midwives, and even poets. Their words, though limited, carried weight. In fact, some of the most beautiful surviving verses from the pre-conquest era are attributed to anonymous women believed to be from temple schools. Lines like, "I planted my heart in the garden of stillness / but it bloomed with thunder," suggest emotional landscapes far more complex than the sanitized virgin archetype. You feel a breeze now, and with it comes a faint scent, copal, maybe, or something darker. Something like memory. You look up and realize you've arrived at a small pond lined with obsidian stones. This, they say, is where the chosen girls once bathed before dawn, washing away dreams they weren't allowed to have. The water is black and still, but if you stare long enough, you swear it moves like something beneath the surface is waiting to speak. You kneel, just for a moment, and you imagine her, the priestess, the girl, the rebel, sinking slowly into the water, letting it close over her body like a second skin, her silence pressing outward in soft waves. This garden wasn't built for peace. It was a crucible, a space where control met chaos, where virginity wasn't an absence of sex, but an abundance of surveillance. And through it all, love still found its way. In poems carved into stone benches, in glances stolen through steam, in petals pressed between prayer books. Love doesn't care about rituals. It has its own. And it always finds the cracks. So tonight, as you drift away with the soft rustle of palm leaves and the slow trickle of ancient water, remember this: not all walls are built to keep people out. Some are built to keep feelings in. But feelings, like roots, don't follow rules. They grow wild in the dark, toward whatever light they can find. And in the Aztec gardens of chastity, they bloomed anyway. Quietly, beautifully, dangerously. You wake, if you ever slept at all, to the sound of drums, soft, slow, like a heartbeat beneath the earth. But there's no one around. Just the mist hanging low over the garden floor, and the sense that someone left in a hurry. The path ahead is lined with crushed petals, deep red, bruised purple, and ochre yellow. still wet with dew or maybe sweat. You can almost hear laughter echoing off the stone walls. Except it isn't joy, it's sharper, like mockery, like someone dared the gods to intervene and live just long enough to regret it. This is where the garden turns, where love stops being poetry and becomes something closer to alchemy. You've stepped into the zone of spells now, of potions, coded offerings, and forbidden flowercraft. Because here, love wasn't left to chance, it was conjured. Or, when necessary, cursed. The Aztecs didn't separate magic from medicine, or medicine from seduction. They brewed their passion with the same intensity they brewed their poisons. Want to win someone's heart? There's a powder for that. Want to make them forget you ever existed? There's a flower you can smoke at dawn. Want to drive them mad with longing until they crawl back to you, weeping and delirious? You're going to need a hummingbird's tongue and some moonlight. Yes, really. One of the most popular love spells required grinding the heart of a dead hummingbird, believed to be the messenger of love gods, into a powder and mixing it with pulque. You then poured it into your beloved's drink while whispering their name backwards. Romantic, right? Historians still argue whether these spells were ever truly effective, or mostly psychological early examples of placebo seduction. But the rituals themselves are well documented, even in the codices burned and half erased by the Spaniards. And the ingredients? Unmistakable. Datura flowers, peyote resin, crushed rosewood bark, and if you were really desperate, a drop of your own blood, mixed into honey and smeared on a flower petal. They called it the petal of truth. If your target licked it, they'd be bound to your breath for as long as the moon stayed full. But there's always a cost. 1. Love spell required not just rare plants, but the nail clippings of your beloved, stolen while they slept. Which raises the question, how many people were prowling bedrooms with obsidian scissors, all in the name of love? One recorded case tells of a merchant's daughter who fell hopelessly in love with a visiting poet. When he left, she reportedly ground his used bathwater into a salve, mixed it with her tears, and spread it beneath her bed every night for a month. On the 30th day, he returned. Coincidence? Or did something darker pull him back? Tonight's sex story is one of mischief and revenge. It comes from the recollections of a Nahua herbalist woman named Tenali, a name that roughly translates to tongue of fire. Known for her sharp wit and unmatched knowledge of plants, she was once the go-to healer for the wives of warriors. But she had a secret sideline, unbinding hearts. If you had a lover you needed to forget, or a man who wouldn't leave you alone, she had powders, potions, and strategies. But her most infamous act came when she fell for a nobleman who was already married. When his wife found out, she confronted Tenali publicly at the market. Instead of apologizing, Tenali handed her a bouquet and walked away. That night, the nobleman grew violently ill. Not fatally, just miserable enough to avoid both women. Within a week, he'd fled to another city. When asked what was in the bouquet, Tenali simply smiled and said, it was never about him. Her shop was busier than ever after that. And here's your quirky tidbit for tonight. Some Aztec love rituals involved edible effigies, tiny human-shaped pastries filled with chili and flour paste. Couples would bite into each other's symbolic bodies during festivals to consume each other's essence. Think Valentine's Day, but you literally eat a version of your partner's face and whisper romantic threats while chewing. Spicy. But not all flower magic was so playful. Some of it veered into dangerous territory. The line between love potion and poison was razor thin. One infamous plant, known as tlapotl, was used in both seduction and assassination. Administered in small doses, it made the subject euphoric and suggestible. In larger amounts, it caused hallucinations, paralysis, and eventually, death. There are accounts of spurned lovers slipping it into ceremonial drinks, leading to accidents. During festivals, falls, drownings, mysterious disappearances. Of course, the priests blamed the gods. They always do. Even the setting mattered. Certain spells only worked if performed under specific trees, or at particular hours of the night. The midnight blooming cereus, for example, was believed to heighten passion when burned during a full moon. But if burned during a waning moon, it invited sorrow. And the garden remembered. People spoke of lovers who returned to the wrong spot, where they'd once pledged their hearts and felt ill for days. As if the earth itself disapproved of second chances, you pause beneath a willow now, one that's grown in a perfect arc. Like the neck of a weeping woman. The bark peels like old skin. There's something tied to the branches, ribbons, bones, maybe dried petals, offerings, remnants, promises unfulfilled. You can almost hear the names whispered on repeat, like a mantra or a curse. This was a wishing tree once. Now it's just a warning, and somewhere behind you a laugh. Quick, feminine, sharp as obsidian. You turn, but no one's there, just the breeze. But it carries the unmistakable scent of burned cinnamon and sweat. Someone lit a spell not long ago. You can feel the trace of it, humming just beneath your skin, like the aftertaste of a kiss you didn't consent to. Because here's the truth about Aztec desire, it was never just about connection. It was about power. Every potion, every petal, every whispered chant was a way to control, to bend another's will, or at the very least, to assert your own. Love wasn't gentle. It was strategic, dangerous, a battlefield in bloom. On heart heavy and limbs slow, not from fatigue but from knowledge. You've seen the gardens, you've felt the pull. And now you know, there are no safe corners in a place where affection is brewed like poison and hearts are shaped like traps. The Aztecs didn't fall in love. They conjured it, bound it, broke. It then started again. Because in this empire, even longing had a recipe. Even heartbreak had a ritual. So tonight, when you lie back and let your dreams carry you, be careful where your mind wanders. The garden is still listening. And if you whisper the wrong name too loudly, well, don't be surprised if the wind whispers it back 3 times, in a voice that isn't yours. You cross the threshold now, from jungle garden to stone plaza, and the change hits you like a shift in temperature. Here, the scent of wet earth gives way to burning copal, roasted maize, and sweat thick with ambition. You've entered the underbelly of the sacred market Tlatelolco, where desire wasn't whispered in gardens but bought, sold, and repackaged as both entertainment and information. Think of it like Wall Street if Wall Street sold aphrodisiacs, poems, and state secrets along with fruit and feathers. Everything here has a price, especially love, especially bodies, especially yours if you're not careful. You hear the echo of sandals against stone, the chant of a flower vendor singing, a double-meaning lullaby, the laugh of a courtesan wrapped in hummingbird silk. This is not a brothel. It's not even hidden. It's the open secret of the empire, a sex economy woven so deeply into public life that most people didn't realize they were participating in it until they'd already paid in Tlatelolco. Brothels often masqueraded as bathhouses or poetry. Schools, places where the line between education and initiation was negotiable. These weren't dingy corners of sin. These were architecturally impressive institutions, complete with courtyards, attendants, and rules of etiquette. The highest-end houses even required appointments and had ranked entertainers known as ahuyanaim, or joyful women who performed music, dance, and recited poetry before ever touching you. And not everyone came for the sex. Some came for the gossip. Because these courtesans weren't just bodies, they were repositories of intel, confessions, pillow talk from the empire's elite. Lovers talked, spies listened. And often, they were the same person. Historians still argue whether the ahuyanaim were respected figures, or simply tolerated under layers of symbolic license. But the codices suggest that many were well educated, politically savvy, and sometimes even held sway over local decisions through their influence on powerful clients. One tale, part folktale, part oral history, tells of a courtesan named Exokanani who became the lover of a military commander. She memorized troop movements by tracing them in bath oils on his chest, then relayed the information to her actual employer, a rival city-state. Her betrayal led to a lost battle, but secured her position as a mythic figure in backroom politics. In some retellings, she's vilified as a seductress traitor. In others, she's a war hero in silk. Tonight's sex story centers on a man once an elderly merchant known only as Feathercloak, whose real name no one seemed to remember. He was famous not for his wealth, but for visiting the same courtesan every 10 days for over 30 years. He brought her news from the road: exotic spices, rare feathers, and once, a monkey that could mimic laughter. She, in return, never accepted. Another client during his visits. No money exchanged hands. Just gifts, stories, and the soft ritual of shared pulque and storytelling. 1 year, during a brutal drought, she didn't appear. He waited 10 days, then another 10. He waited 10 days, then another 10. On the 30th day, he collapsed at her doorstep, exhausted and crying. She had died 2 weeks earlier. Her neighbors buried her in a cloak he had gifted her, a tapestry of green quetzal feathers so fine. It shimmered in the moonlight. They say he never returned to Tlatelolco after that. But once a year, on the anniversary of her death, a fresh bowl of pulque appeared at her grave. Always still warm, but back to business, because that's what this place was underneath the seduction. Business. The pleasure economy was a complex, stratified system. There were different levels of erotic performers, from temple dancers to informal street entertainers, to highly trained companions who understood music theory, astrology, and diplomacy. Some doubled as legal scribes, others as herbalists. All knew how to read a room before it read them. Their survival depended on it. And while some entered this life by choice, following family tradition or personal ambition, others were sold into it by desperate relatives, or funneled in through temple redirection programs, which sounds nicer than it was. And yet, many of these women forged power in their role. Their influence reached beyond bedrooms. A courtesan might overhear a trade agreement being negotiated, or learn of a scandal that hadn't yet reached the court. She could pass information, blackmail, or tip the balance of an alliance with a well-timed anecdote. That's why some brothels were monitored by the priesthood, not because they disapproved, but because they didn't want to miss anything. Here's your quirky tidbit for tonight. Some high-end houses had secret poetry duels, where clients and courtesans would try to out-metaphor each other before intimacy could proceed. If your verse wasn't clever enough, no access. Think of it like Tinder, but you had to win a haiku battle first. The best lines were memorized, passed around, sometimes even painted on ceramics. One plate unearthed from a noble home reads, "You are the steam before my skin knows it burns." Subtle dot, and the rituals extended to scent. Courtesans in the upper ranks were known for developing signature fragrances, custom blends of flowers, oils, and even rare bird resins. These scents became part of their identity, worn like a second name. One was known as the woman who smelled like midnight rain, another, she who carries the storm. Clients could recognize them blindfolded, and did. Often this was not a shameful life. It was theatrical, coded, dangerous, and often tragic but not shameful. Many of these women outlived their clients, amassed fortunes, and were buried with honors. Some even left behind coded memoirs, scraps of verse or flower arrangements found in their chambers after death, hinting at the depth of their lives beyond the silk and songs. But don't let the beauty fool you. This world was not kind, it was transactional. And every transaction came with risk. For a courtesan, a wrong word could mean exile. For a client, A wrong confession could end up in the hands of an enemy, and for both, the illusion of intimacy often blurred into real longing, which was the most dangerous currency of all. You pass a crumbling wall now, once painted with a mural of dancing women holding lily and knives, an apt image. The lily have faded. The knives remain. And etched below, barely legible, to love in this place is to gamble with your name. You believe it, because love here wasn't just about pleasure. It was about access, influence, performance, risk. It wasn't whispered under trees. It was sung in front of audiences, traded in marketplaces, weaponized in politics. You didn't just fall in love. You negotiated it, you sold it, and sometimes you watched it disappear into someone else's hands while you smiled and pretended it never hurt. And as you leave the plaza, the scent of roasted corn and honeyed smoke clinging to your clothes, you can't help but feel the pulse of it all still alive. The marketplace might be dust now, the brothels long buried, but the system, the performance, the whisper beneath the trade, still there. Rewritten, repackaged, digitized maybe, but breathing. And somewhere, even now, someone's love is being bought, sold, or spun into something else entirely. The wind shifts again. And it's different this time, not a breeze, but a soft rhythmic gust, like breath through bone flutes, carrying a fragrance so thick and sweet, it makes your head tilt back without thinking. The scent is unfamiliar, and yet deeply human. Beneath the garden's layers of politics and performance, you've wandered into something even more ancient. A shrine ringed in carved obsidian, open to the sky, where the stories aren't whispered. In metaphors, they're painted in blood and flower juice. You're standing before the gods now, and they aren't subtle. Especially not the ones who govern desire. Forget the sanitized stories. The Aztecs didn't just have love gods. They had gender-bending, body-shifting, rage-kissing, lust-demanding deities who didn't care about your preferences or your comfort. These gods wanted offerings, and they wanted them wrapped in longing. Right in front of you is a low altar, with the faint outline of twin figures carved into the stone. One wears flowers in their hair. The other wears a serpent belt. Both figures merge at the waist, their faces turned toward each other in a kiss that never ends. This is no abstract symbol, it's Quetzalcoatl, the Prince of Flowers, god of art, song, and yes, erotic ecstasy. And standing beside him in some versions, or inside him in others, is Uxafetzal, goddess of beauty, weaving, and female pleasure. But here's the twist. Quetzalcoatl doesn't stay in one body. In various myths, he appears male, female, both, or neither, his energy unbothered by the binaries that modern minds cling to like life rafts in a sea of nuance. Historians still argue whether these deities were understood as literally non-binary, or metaphorically so, but the rituals dedicated to them tell their own story. In one temple dedicated to Quetzalcoatl, dancers wore masks that blended masculine and feminine features, moved in swirling spirals instead of straight lines, and spoke in riddles that inverted gender roles mid-sentence. It wasn't performance. It was revelation. You didn't just worship the Prince of Flowers, you became him. You stepped into the petals, into the ambiguity, and if you came out changed, that was the point. And yes, these rituals were erotic. Not crude, not orgiastic, but deeply, deliberately sensual. Participants wore garlands soaked in oils, painted their skin with crushed beetles and blossoms, and sang songs that looped like mantras. I am the flower, iam testem. I am the hand that plucks myself. Try forgetting that one. Some ceremonies required fasting, others required indulgence. All demanded honesty. If you lied to Quetzalcoatl, if you danced without wanting to, or kissed without meaning it, it was said your skin would itch until you confessed your true desires. And not just to the gods, to yourself. Tonight's story is about a dancer named Quetzalcoatl, whose name means wolf, a man raised in the military caste who chose, at 15, to leave the warrior path and join the House of Flowers. His father disowned him, his brothers mocked him. But cute Lackley stayed, learned the sacred dances, the herbal infusions, the pressure points along the spine that caused laughter when touched just so. He became a master performer, known not for his beauty, but for his transformations. At one festival, he danced the roles of 10 different lovers from 10 different myths, all genders, all moods, all styles of yearning. By the end, the audience wept, not from sorrow, from recognition. He reminded them of every version of themselves they'd ever had to hide. Later in life, he trained others, warriors, priestesses, wandering scribes, anyone brave enough to shed the outer husk of identity and step into the slippery truth of desire. He died quietly, surrounded by students. His final words, according to legend, were "keep the rhythm, even when you forget the steps." And here's your quirky tidbit for tonight. Aztec myth includes a figure named Tlazolteotl, sometimes known as the Eater of Filth. She's a cleansing goddess, protector of midwives, patron of lust, and absorber of sins. During specific ceremonies, people would confess their sexual transgressions to her priests, not to be punished, but to be purified. The records describe these rituals with phrases like, "She consumes what is spoiled, so you may bloom again." It's one of the only pre-modern systems where guilt and desire weren't enemies, just dance partners, occasionally drunk. You begin to notice now that even the birds here seem different. One flutters above the altar, its feathers a shimmering mix of green, pink, and slate gray, colors not seen in any natural combination. Could be a trick of the light, or maybe a leftover from those old rituals. The birds were believed to be messengers, sure, but also incarnations. You didn't just see a bird and think animal. You watched it and wondered which god it was wearing that day. There are still modern descendants of these traditions in remote villages where gender-diverse shamans bless marriages, or herbalists prepare flower bundles to honor both masculine and feminine energy in newborns. The garden didn't die. It just went underground. Some say it lives in certain dances, others in the cadence of love songs. But those who felt it know, the Prince of Flowers hasn't left. He's just waiting for the right scent to rise. You linger now, uncertain. The altar feels alive beneath your feet, humming with a frequency you can't quite place. Not fear, not arousal, something bigger. You're not sure what you've stepped into, but you're not sure you want to. Leave her. Because in this place, every rule you thought you knew about desire, about gender, about roles, they've melted. Here, you're allowed to be everything at once, or nothing at all, and no one will ask you to explain. You trace a finger over the carved figures again. They're dancing, yes, but also merging, each one part of the other. And you realize this was never about opposites, never about conflict. It was always about return, about remembering that pleasure, real pleasure, isn't about control. It's about surrender to the moment, to the body, to the mystery. And as you finally step back, letting the vines reclaim the path behind you, you hear it again, that soft wind, fragrant and strange. Not the scent of roses or lily, but of crushed marigold and damp obsidian. A scent that says, gently but firmly, you're not done here. Not yet, because the garden remembers. And it's not finished telling you who you really are. You smell it before you see it. Burned sage, sweat, and something metallic, like iron in rainwater. You've wandered too far now. The garden's softness hardens underfoot. The flowers give way to stone, and the gentle chirping of birds is drowned out by something lower. Deeper, the pulse of drums, so slow, they sound like the earth's own heartbeat. There's a silence here that feels forced, heavy, as if the air itself is holding its breath. You've arrived at the place people don't talk about, unless they have to. The place where desire and death flirt with each other in broad daylight, while everyone pretends not to watch. The erotic altar of sacrifice. No, not metaphor, not poetry, not some romanticized nonsense about love being pain. We're talking literal ritual, blood, ecstasy, transcendence, and you can't look away. This is the side of Aztec desire that unnerves even seasoned historians. Because the rituals of love and death weren't opposites in this world, they were partners, lovers even, inseparable. The same way rain follows thunder, or night follows dusk. To offer your body in pleasure was one form of devotion. To offer your body in death, the final consummation, not punishment, not tragedy, a kind of orgasmic return to the gods. And in some cases, the two happened in the same breath. There are records, faint but insistent, of sacrificial ceremonies that included acts of physical intimacy, performed not as spectacle, but as sacred reenactments of the gods' own mythic entanglements. The joining of bodies before the tearing apart, the bloom before the blade. Historians still argue whether these tales reflect widespread practice or isolated ritual theater, but the documentation is persistent. One surviving Nahuatl song, believed to have been used during spring equinox ceremonies, includes the line, "He pressed her breath to his, beneath the sacred drum, and when the sun rose, she was gone but the flower remained." Interpret that how you will, but the metaphors aren't subtle. Tonight's sex story is one of those tales that flickers between devotion and discomfort. It's about a young man named Tenochtitlan, fire serpent, chosen not for beauty or valor, but for his singing voice. He was trained as a ritual singer for the feast of Tezcatlipoca, the god of night, sorcery, and mirrored truths. At 18, he was selected for a high ceremony, told he would sing the creation song atop the Templo Mayor at sunrise. What he wasn't told, at least not until the night before, was that he'd also be participating in the sacred union. A priestess, masked and painted in silver, led him through a ritual bath, covered his skin in flower oil, and whispered the words of the gods into his mouth. They were joined beneath a canopy of feathers, surrounded by incense, while the temple priests chanted the story of the divine twins who became one and then were torn apart. When dawn broke, Tenochtitlan was sacrificed, not because he sinned, but because his joy was the offering. And the story goes that no singer ever hit that final note the way he did. Shocking? Yes, but not gratuitous. Because for the Aztecs, the idea of offering beauty to the gods wasn't horror, it was logic. You give your best. Your strongest, your sweetest, your most loved. And sometimes, that meant giving what was most alive. The erotic charge wasn't incidental. It was essential. The gods didn't want dry prayers. They wanted intensity. And what's more intense than love and death tangled together beneath a rising sun? Of course, not all sacrifices were so ceremonious. Some were brutal, hurried, political. But in the garden spaces, especially those used in seasonal rites, there was a different tone. More intimate. The sacrifices here weren't always public. Some took place under moonlight, in courtyards surrounded by fragrant herbs and perfumed oils. The air thick with emotion, not fear. And in rare accounts, it said that the one being offered was allowed to choose their final companion. A lover, a friend, someone to hold them, to sing them into the next world. To remind the gods that this wasn't just a body, it was a story. A kiss, a song with no end. Here's your quirky tidbit for tonight. Some sacrificial victims were jewelry shaped, like flowers with hidden obsidian blades inside. Not as weapons, as symbols. The idea was that beauty and danger coexisted inseparably. One surviving ornament, found buried in the ruins of a private garden, featured a carved lily that opened to reveal a bloodstone center. Scholars believe it belonged to a ritual dancer who was offered during the Festival of Droughts. Her dance was said to have summoned rain. Her death, a guarantee of renewal. And it wasn't always human sacrifice either. Animals played their part. Birds, especially. Hummingbirds were favorites not because they were expendable, but because they were sacred to the love gods. In one rite, a pair of lovers would raise a hummingbird together, feeding it, caring for it, whispering secrets into its wings. Then, at the end of the moon cycle, they'd release it or offer it, depending on the omens. Release meant their bond would flourish. Offering meant it would end. The gods, presumably, chose which was necessary. You stand now in a space that defies logic. A courtyard open to the stars, ringed with scorched tiles and flower petals. In the center, a stone slab shaped like a heart, stained from centuries of weather and memory. Around it, faint outlines of footprints. You wonder how many stood here. Willingly? Fearfully? Or with their head tilted back in some kind of ecstatic defiance? And what did they see in those final moments? Faces of gods or faces of lovers? The air here is impossibly still, not dead, just waiting. Like the garden itself remembers every offering, every kiss before the knife, every body that trembled not from terror but from meaning. And as the moon climbs higher, casting silver across the stone, you feel something shift in your chest. Not grief, not fear, something heavier, reverence maybe, or recognition. Because this part of the story isn't about horror. It's about intensity. About a worldview that dared to put desire and mortality in the same sentence without flinching. A world where pleasure wasn't escapism, it was commitment. To feel something so deeply that you'd give everything. And maybe, just maybe, that's a kind of love we've forgotten how to hold. You leave the courtyard slowly. The air clings to you, thick with incense and the echo of drums that never fully stop. Somewhere, you swear, someone is still singing. A lullaby, a love song, a farewell. It's all the same here. The wind is warmer now, and with it comes the sound of flutes mellow, swaying, a little mischievous, like someone telling secrets between sips of honeyed pulque. You follow it instinctively, past a wall covered in climbing vines shaped like serpents curling toward the sun. The path is soft underfoot, crushed petals and fine gravel, and you realize without warning you're walking into a training ground. Not for soldiers, not for scribes, for seducers. Welcome to the House of Youth. But don't be fooled by the name, it wasn't a schoolyard. It was a furnace, shaping young men into instruments of beauty and persuasion. The Aztecs didn't leave desire to chance. If you were born into the warrior caste, they trained your hands to fight. But if you were born with a different gift, a lilt in your voice, a way of listening, a glance that could silence a room, then you were trained to seduce, and not for fun. For Empire, the Tupocali schools for boys weren't just about military drills and stone lifting. In some districts, especially those closer to the imperial court, select students were pulled aside, whispered evaluations, quiet recommendations. These weren't the loud boys. These were the ones who understood timing, who knew how to move. Like water. Their curriculum included flower arrangement, poetic structure, facial reading, scent blending, and flute playing, each lesson a brushstroke in the painting of erotic diplomacy. Yes, diplomacy. Because the Aztecs knew something most empires forget. You can conquer with spears, but you can control with charm. And these boys, these barely men, were trained to walk into rival courts, perform a gesture, recite a verse, light a garden torch at just the right moment, and watch a potential rebellion dissolve into soft sighs. Historians still argue whether this kind of grooming was widespread or limited to the elites, but surviving codices hint at a network of garden emissaries, young men fluent in the language of desire, sent out like living gifts to smooth tensions or stir allegiances. There's a story of one such figure, known only as a Catanal, he who smells like rain. He was sent to a minor noblewoman, known for her resistance to court alliances. She rejected all offers. Until a Catanal arrived not with gifts, not with bribes, but with a single verse. whispered in Nahuatl under her window. You are the flower that refused the sun. I am the storm that makes you bloom. She married into the empire within a year. Tonight's sex story? Let's make it about the lessons themselves. Picture this, a boy of 15, slight but steady, brought into a circular room lined with hanging fabrics, incense pools, and teachers who speak in riddles. His first task? Watch a flame, just a flame, flickering, and describe it using nothing but emotion. Then translate that emotion into gesture, then that gesture into a dance, then that dance into a whisper, then that whisper into silence. If he can do all that without losing the meaning, he's ready to write his first love poem. That was day one. These schools weren't soft. They were rigorous. Fail a metaphor? You scrub floors. Misuse a flower? You fast until you understand its symbolism. Cry? Good. That means you're breaking open. That means you're learning to hold feeling without collapsing under it. Because if you can't hold your own heart, how can you possibly carry someone else's? And here's your quirky tidbit for tonight. Part of the training involved scent matching. Students had to identify over 100 flower oils by smell alone and pair them to specific emotional states. Joy was marigold with crushed vanilla. Melancholy was orchid and copal. Passion, jasmine and smoked maize. Once mastered, these oils were used in courtship, painted on the wrists, behind the ears, even on the tongue. A single kiss could deliver a bouquet of meaning. Subtle, complex, unforgettable, but not everyone made it through. Some students cracked under the pressure. Some chose to abandon the path, joining the regular warrior ranks, instead preferring blades to riddles. Yet others transformed. They became living metaphors. When they spoke, it felt like music. When they walked into a room, conversations shifted. Not because they were loud, but because they understood silence. They weren't lovers. They were tacticians in perfume and poetry. And sometimes, yes, they fell in love, but never without strategy. Never without risk. There's a tale of one such graduate named Lost, title remembered, The Orchid's Ghost. He was said to have seduced an enemy ambassador during trade negotiations, not through physical touch, but through 6 nights of poetry left on banana leaves beside the diplomat's guest bed. No signature, no pressure, just feeling. On the 7th day, the ambassador tore up the treaty he came with and agreed to a new one, softer terms, open ports, more tribute. When asked why, he said, "Because the empire remembered how to speak to me." The poet was never seen again. These seducers weren't just artists. They were archivists of human tension. They knew how to read the space between breath and heartbeat. How to time a gaze so that it landed like a promise and a question at once. They weren't trained to seduce everyone, just the right ones. The dangerous ones. The ones whose hearts, if swayed, could shift the course of war. And of course, not all lessons were grand. Some were heartbreakingly tender. One diary fragment believed to be a training note reads, "He cannot stop crying when he sees hibiscus. We do not stop him. We teach him to use the tears. They are real. Real is rare." Another entry, likely from the same instructor. "He tried to kiss the moon. We gave him a mirror. He kissed that too." Progress. By the time these boys left, they weren't boys. They weren't quite men either. They were vessels. Carriers of an old knowledge that seduction isn't about possession. It's about transformation. You don't make someone want you. You make them see themselves more clearly. And if they want to be seen again, they'll return. You reach the end of the path now, and it opens into a clearing lit by glowstones, tiny, luminescent minerals said to catch emotion like dew. Around the edge, markers for each graduating class. No names, just scents and verses. You inhale, and one note stands out. You kissed me before the song ended, and now every silence hums. You don't know who wrote it, but you feel it, in your throat, in your chest, in the garden's breath. Because this place didn't just train seducers, it trained memory. And memory, in the hands of a skilled lover, is the most dangerous tool of all. There's a different hush here, one that clings to your skin like silk dipped in smoke. You step into a courtyard shaped like a crescent moon, its stone floor warm from the day's heat and littered with crushed blossoms, whose scent rises like ghosts. And standing in the center, tall, immovable, and covered in faint carvings, is the statue of a woman with her hand outstretched and her eyes closed. She is serene, but not soft. This is not the face of a romantic. This is the face of someone who knows exactly what she wants and how to get it. You've entered the domain of power players. Lovers who did not ask. Priestesses who did not wait. Women who shaped history with their bedsheets and their veils and their words, and who sometimes made kings wish they'd never been born. Because while the Aztec world was tightly structured, tightly gendered, and often violently hierarchical, desire, as usual, refused to follow rules. High-ranking women, especially those connected to temples, noble lineages, or powerful merchant clans, had more tools than anyone liked to admit, and they knew how to use them. Not just to survive, to win, to seduce, manipulate, protect, and punish. And the garden? It was often their stage, their trap, their arena, their escape route. 1,000 uses for a place where no one spoke plainly, and everyone walked barefoot, so no secrets would be startled away. Historians still argue whether women in the priesthood held true authority, or simply ceremonial influence, but a growing pile of coded poetry, song fragments, and frustrated Spanish missionary complaints suggest that many priestesses were both feared and desired. They weren't virgins in the European sense. They were untouched by obligation. They were considered living vessels of goddesses, especially Exohuquetzal, who governed beauty, fertility, and female pleasure. To sleep with a priestess wasn't just a pleasure, it was a risk, a gamble with fate, because some were believed to carry the power to either bless or unmake your lineage. And if you wronged one, you wouldn't just be cursed. You'd be forgotten. One of the most storied examples is the legend of Sitlamina, she who shoots stars, a priestess of the moon goddess Coyolxauhqui. She served in the upper garden temples, which were reserved for seasonal rites involving both fertility and military omens. A nobleman once mocked her during a ceremonial dance, saying her steps reminded him of a deer slipping in mud. She did not reply. She simply lit an incense bowl, whispered into it, and turned away. Within a month, the nobleman lost favor, his estate, and eventually, his memory. Every court painter erased his face from their murals. Even his servants forgot. His name, some say Sitlamina cursed him with oblivion. Others say she simply knew how to humiliate someone with patience. Either way, her temple saw a sharp increase in floral donations after that. Tonight's sex story is a quieter one, but no less charged. It's the tale of a priestess named Osaloxochitl, Jaguar Flower, who was chosen at a young age for her ability to memorize long chants after a single hearing. She was trained not just in prayer, but in negotiation. At 22, she was sent as an envoy to a distant trade city, rumored to be considering rebellion. The official story was that she was delivering sacred relics. The unofficial reality? She was there to seduce the city's young ruler, a man famous for his aversion to both marriage and politics. Osaloxochitl did not flirt. She listened. She asked questions. She offered honeyed drinks and wore no perfume. And on the fourth night, she recited one of his dead mother's songs perfectly, without notes, with a single tear at the final verse. That was it. No kisses, no drama. The next day, he signed the treaty. She returned to Tenochtitlan alone, praised but unspoken of. Her role was never recorded officially, but a mural in the garden chamber of her order shows a jaguar wrapped in vines, lying in moonlight with a crown in its mouth. Here's your quirky tidbit for the night. High-ranking women often communicated through flower bundles. which were more than just gifts. They were coded messages, each flower meaning something different. One bundle, containing a wilted rose, a green orchid, and a sprig of mint, translated roughly to, "I regret nothing, but don't test me again." These bundles were delivered by discreet servants or hidden in ceremonial baskets. Some messages were so artfully arranged, they were mistaken for offerings to the gods, when in reality, they were veiled threats or invitations. But don't mistake subtlety for weakness. These women were not passive observers in the game of desire. They directed it. One poem, attributed to an anonymous court lady, reads, "He came to me with a heart of stone. He planted lilias ture. Now he walks soft and weeps for me in gardens. He cannot name. The voice is calm, but the message, total dominance." And the priestesses weren't the only women who wielded this power. Wives of nobles, wealthy merchants, even seasoned entertainers, all of them learned to turn attention into leverage. Some manipulated inheritance. Others leveraged rumors. One woman, recorded simply as Yoyamiddle, was said to have caused 3 different district leaders to declare love for her in the same season. She didn't marry any of them. She opened a public bathhouse funded by their gifts and staffed it with retired priestesses looking to stay useful. It became a hub for political whispering, matchmaking, and low-key diplomacy. A place where deals were sealed with massage oil and sealed again with poetry. These women were rarely written about directly. Their names were almost always erased or disguised, but their fingerprints are everywhere. In the architecture of pleasure houses, in the layout of garden paths that encourage overheard conversations, in the rhythms of ceremonial dances designed to expose more than they conceal. They were architects of possibility. You pause at a stone bench carved with the image of a flower, bending in the wind, but not breaking. Below it, a line of text, "She who bends writes the wind's direction." It's not a quote from a famous poet. It's a proverb traced to the private schools for noble girls. A reminder that in a society where men wore feathers and shouted on temples, some women simply rearranged the silence and waited for history to echo in their direction. Because power doesn't always need volume. Sometimes it's a glance across. A garden, a flower chosen with precision, a poem sent anonymously, a decision made while pouring tea. And in the Aztec world, where desire was part of the divine, the women who mastered that realm were not ornaments. They were conductors, not just of pleasure, but of fate. You step away from the statue now, the garden air thick with the scent of hibiscus and something sharper like ink on skin. You realize the stories aren't buried. They're alive. In the breeze that lifts, the hem of your robe, in the flicker of torchlight across the petals, in the memory of a voice that never had to shout to be obeyed. Because she's still here. All of them are. And they're watching, listening, waiting for you to understand that in this place, to love well was to rule quietly. And to rule quietly was to never be forgotten. You wake to a different kind of stillness, the kind that feels like a held breath in a crowded room, like a story paused just before the twist. The garden isn't quiet, it's watching. And you feel that watchfulness settle on your shoulders as you step into a grove darker than the others. The air heavy with resin smoke and thick with the sting of something unseen. This is no lover's lane. It's a judgment hall disguised as a flower bed. Because for all the seductive moonlight and poet-laced metaphors, the Aztecs were not gentle with desire, not always, and certainly not for everyone. Here, sex could be sacred, but it could just as easily be shameful, dangerous, or punishable by death. Especially if you had the wrong body or the wrong desire. Or if you got caught enjoying something you were never meant to touch. Welcome to the shadow side of the garden, where the rules of moral order weren't just written in codices. They were carved into bones. The Aztec Empire had a deeply structured moral code around sexuality, one shaped by status, gender, religion, and timing. timing mattered a lot. Make love on the wrong festival day or during the wrong moon cycle, and you risked spiritual contamination. Engage in sex outside the parameters of your caste or rank. That wasn't just scandal, it could be cosmic disorder. And the penalties weren't abstract. A noble caught seducing a commoner could be stripped of their land and paraded naked before being ritually shamed or exiled. A woman accused of promiscuity outside of sanctioned rites might be beaten, disfigured, or publicly humiliated with a head-shaving ceremony that marked her as spiritually impure. It didn't matter if the relationship was consensual. What mattered was control. Who had it? Who lost it? And who had the power to pretend it wasn't about desire at all? Historians still debate how much of this morality code was enforced daily, and how much was performative, a way for the elite to reinforce their own image of discipline while quietly indulging behind veils of incense. But the punishments are real, documented. One particularly cruel method was flower punishment, where offenders were forced to wear elaborate wreaths of fragrant blooms while being mocked or paraded, turning beauty into a signal of disgrace. The metaphor was brutal. You smelled like a lover, but no one would touch you again. And yet, like all empires, hypocrisy bloomed right alongside the rules. There are entire volumes of complaints from colonial friars about Aztec double standards. How male nobility could keep dozens of concubines while women were punished for a single misstep. One friar wrote, "They speak of purity, and yet their festivals begin with dance and end with strangers." Another noted with frustration that many of the same judges who punished improper desire were known to frequent garden courtesans and leave generous offerings afterward. Sound familiar? Tonight's sex story is one of sharp edges and soft tragedy. It's the story of a woman named Tenochtitlan, she who opens the path, a temple singer known for her clear voice and strict devotion. She was considered the embodiment of restraint, never seen laughing too loud, never accepting gifts, never lingering in the garden after sunset. Until one day, she was caught. Not in bed, not even in flirtation. Simply smiling too long. A fellow singer saw her passing a young apprentice and claimed her glance lingered a beat too long. The accusation was vague, but powerful. She was summoned, interrogated, and when she refused to confess or name the boy, she was punished. Her punishment: silence. A ritual vow that forbade her from singing for a full year. Her voice, the very thing she was known for, gone by decree. She obeyed. But when the year ended, and the priests gathered to hear her voice again, she stepped forward, opened her mouth, and said nothing. She never sang again. Her silence, a louder rebellion than any confession could have been. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some regions, the Aztecs used a flower called Itzpapalakla's whisper, named after the obsidian butterfly goddess, as a test of chastity. It had a scent said to change depending on the emotional state of the person smelling it. Temple instructors used it in ritual tests. If the flower's scent soured, it was believed the person held forbidden desire. Scientific? Not remotely, but symbolic, extremely, and probably terrifying for adolescent trying not to think impure thoughts during morning prayer. It begins as a tingle on your tongue, the ghost of a flavor you can't place. Then it spreads to your fingertips, like you've dipped your hands into warm nectar. The garden has changed again. The air pulses with a sweetness that borders on overwhelming orchid, vanilla, pulque, and something sharp underneath, like hot pepper smoke hiding in roses. You've stumbled into the hidden apothecary of the empire's most whispered arts, the flower war room, the lab of living lust. This is where the Aztecs brewed desire, where petals were crushed into powder, roots simmered in sacred water, and perfumes were sharpened into weapons. Because here, love was not just a feeling, it was chemistry. And if you knew what you were doing, you could bottle a heartbeat, paint a kiss into skin, or infuse a breeze with longing. Aphrodisiacs were not fringe curiosities in Aztec society. They were serious business, as regulated and respected as military training or religious ceremony. Certain markets had entire aisles dedicated to pleasure botanicals, some meant to stimulate, others to numb, some to arouse, and a few to punish. The line between potion and poison was thin and often deliberately crossed. You hold a jar in your hand now, filled with crushed black orchid and fire pepper, used not to enhance desire, but to create the illusion of it. The target would become flushed, breathless, pupils wide hallmarks of passion, but inside, panic, confusion. It was used in court games, political flirtations, and once, according to a court ledger, by a priestess to expose a liar who claimed to be in love. Historians still debate how scientifically effective these mixtures were versus their psychological impact. But results mattered more than reasoning. One mixture known as Xochitl breath blended fermented marigold with tobacco resin and powdered cacao. Taken in liquid form, it caused vivid romantic hallucinations, often involving specific people the user longed for or feared. In one recorded case, a merchant confessed to loving his enemy after a single dose. The next day, he gifted the man his entire stock of feathers. The spell? Maybe, or maybe just honesty brewed in a flower pot. Tonight's sex story centers on a woman named Tlapeltic, she of the red hue, an herbalist in the outer gardens who was famous not just for her potions, but for her refusals. She didn't sell to just anyone. Her customers had to describe, in full poetic form, what kind of love they were chasing. Was it longing, revenge, curiosity? Only then would she mix something, choosing herbs based on the rhythm of the speakers. Voice. One day, a warrior approached her, asking for a mixture to make a woman fall in love with him. She refused. Said love was not something she brewed on behalf of cowards. He came back with a different request. Give me a potion that makes me brave enough to speak without fear. She gave it to him. It turned out to be water. He spoke to the woman anyway. They were together for 30 years, but not all botanical blends were innocent. Some were dark, targeted, vengeful. One infamous blend called Ixnexli's Bane included crushed wormwood, raw chili, and the ash of a burned letter. It was used in rituals to sever romantic ties, to remove the memory of a lover's touch or dull the ache of betrayal. Administered via smoke, it caused hours of sleep filled with forgetful dreams. One noble woman reportedly requested it after her lover married someone else. She said she wanted to smell like indifference again. 3 days after taking the treatment, she threw a party and danced until dawn, never mentioning his name again. Here's your quirky tidbit for tonight. The Aztecs believed that certain flowers could hear your intentions, specifically. The listening lily, a white flower with pink streaks, was thought to change scent depending on whether you approached it with lust or love. Lovers often placed the flower between them while speaking. If its petals curled inward, it was considered a sign of impure intentions. Superstition? Sure, but entire courtships were ended because of one wilted lily, and flower warfare wasn't just metaphorical. In diplomatic gardens where rival nobles met for ritual strolls and song exchanges, certain flowers were planted with intent. A blossom of red lotus in bloom meant openness. A patch of drooping sun blossoms, insult. A rare black iris placed along a path. That was war. One garden record from the court of Montezuma, the second, notes that a visiting ambassador refused to enter the Emperor's Grove after spotting a single flower facing away from the path, interpreted as a personal rejection. The meeting was delayed by a week while priests consulted omens and rearranged the flower beds. Yes, really. You walk now through a corridor flanked by stone basins, each filled with water and floating petals, an ancient catalog of desires. Tools. Some were meant to heighten touch. Others dulled memory. Some caused dreams of the dead, so you could ask an ancestor whether to pursue a lover. The most elite mixtures weren't drunk or applied. They were worn smeared onto the wrists or neck, activated by sweat and sunlight, releasing invisible trails of emotion. A nobleman named Tekuihua reportedly used a rare perfume of snake flower and jasmine so potent that any woman who smelled it was said to dream of him for 3 nights. He used it only twice. The second time, the woman he courted woke up crying, married someone else, and refused to explain why. He threw the mixture into the lake. Some say it still lingers on the wind near his old estate. The potency of these creations wasn't just chemical. It was cultural, emotional, symbolic. To give someone a potion wasn't casual, it was a confession. A risk, and often a final act. One coded poem, preserved in a fragment of bark paper, reads, "I gave you the breath of the heart flower. You gave me silence. Now even my sweat remembers you." Not a curse, just a fact. And these practices weren't gendered the way you'd expect. Women, non-binary people, all were both makers and users. Priests used them in rituals. Courtesans used them in seductions. Warriors used them before battle to sharpen emotion into rage or passion. Even children were taught flower lore, though theirs leaned toward dream work and sleep. It wasn't potion culture. It was just life. You pause now at a low altar made of obsidian, where flower pigments have been ground into a swirling mosaic of colors that shift as you move. At the center, a single dried blossom, blue, thorny, strangely shaped. You lean closer and read the phrase etched beneath it. Take only what you can carry in your breath. A reminder, perhaps, that these pleasures were never meant to last forever. Just long enough to change you, because the Aztecs didn't treat desire like a mystery to solve. They treated it like a storm to ride, with flowers as sails, with scent as compass, and with no guarantee of return. You turn a corner and stop short, not because there's danger, but because you've stumbled into something so absurdly beautiful, it feels staged. A garden within the garden, tiered, symmetrical, gleaming from last night's drizzle. Petals arranged by color, pathways framed with volcanic stone, fountains singing in different tones, depending on which way the wind blows. But it's not the perfection that stuns you, it's the subtle competition pulsing beneath it. This isn't some royal daydream. It's a battleground. A passive-aggressive war fought with leaves, light, and lust. You've entered the arena of Aztec noble gardens, where erotic prestige wasn't whispered, it was grown. This was no simple horticulture. Among the upper classes, gardens weren't just for pleasure or status. They were tactical displays of sensual power. Who had the rarest bloom, the most intoxicating scent, the most delicate flower that only opened during eclipses? These weren't hobbies, they were declarations. Statements like, "My household understands beauty better than yours. My lovers experience ecstasy at a higher botanical frequency. My gods are better pleased. In a world where metaphor ruled and power never spoke plainly, flowers became weapons. And noblemen? They became obsessed with winning at love without ever saying the word. Some of these garden rivalries were legendary. One famous case involves 2 neighboring nobles, Tenochtitlan and Itzcoatl, who spent decades trying to outblossom each other. When Tenochtitlan imported a rare singing flower from the eastern jungles, Itzcoatl responded by commissioning a moonlit fountain that sprayed perfume instead of water. Tenochtitlan retaliated by training parrots to mimic erotic poetry and perch in his garden walls, reciting sonnets to startled guests. The feud ended only when both men died. The gardens still exist, still competing, still blooming like they've never forgiven each other. Historians still argue whether these flower feuds were symbolic or literal extensions of political rivalries, but there's no doubt that they mattered. Garden prestige influenced marriage prospects, trade agreements, and even judicial rulings. One court case in Tenochtitlan was reportedly settled in favor of the noble whose garden produced a blue variant of the shoketel flower, the rarest hue at the time and allegedly known to enhance fertility. Coincidence? Or did the judge simply feel more inspired after walking past the garden's scented archways? We'll never know. Tonight's sex story fits perfectly into this world. It's the tale of a garden designer named Tenochtitlan, a commoner who rose to fame not through birth, but through touch. He could arrange petals in patterns that made people weep. He understood symmetry, scent layering, color transitions, and most crucially, how to manipulate mood through texture. He was hired by dozens of nobles to transform their private love gardens into sensory masterpieces. But one patron, a widowed noblewoman named Ayaka, gave him full creative control. Her only instruction? Make it feel like something. Was just whispered. Tenochtitlan created a garden that only bloomed between midnight and 3 a.m. No one else was allowed inside. For 3 years, she visited it nightly, alone. Then one night, she invited him. He never left. Their affair became myth, though no one ever saw them together in public. When she died, she was buried beneath the tree he planted at the center. A ghost orchid said to smell like rain and skin. And here's your quirky tidbit. Certain flowers were patented. Not legally, of course, but ritually. If you developed a new hybrid, say, a jasmine lily cross with a color that didn't exist before, you could perform a naming rite, have it blessed by a priest, and use it exclusively for 5 years in ceremonies. After that, it was released to the public, but until then, that flower was your brand, your signature, your love letter to the empire's senses. The most famous of these was the smoke petal, a gray-violet bloom that only opened when the air was thick with incense. It was used in seduction rituals, buried in bridal beds, and burned in goodbye offerings for lovers lost to war. And gardens weren't just aesthetic. They were interactive. Some featured hidden paths that only opened when you stepped in the right pattern. Others had water channels that cooled the air in specific corners, creating temperature shifts that mimic touch. One garden, built for a high-ranking priestess, included mirrors carved from polished obsidian and arranged so that any visitor would see themselves doubled once as they were, and once as they desired to be. Guests often left changed. Some never returned. These love gardens weren't just private. They were elite stages for performance, storytelling, even espionage. During certain festivals, nobles would invite each other to stroll their groves under pretense of poetry or trade talk. But everyone knew what was really happening. Subtle flexes, coded confessions, flirtations folded into flower choices. One man reportedly proposed an alliance by arranging a bed of red petals shaped like a serpent's tongue, with a single white blossom at the tip symbolizing honesty through danger. The offer was accepted. No words exchanged, just flowers. And history turned, but these were also risky places. Build a garden too elaborate, and you might be accused of arrogance. Too sensual, and priests might question your piety. Too subtle, and your rivals would think you had nothing to show. It was a constant dance between seduction and strategy. One wrong flower, and your reputation wilted. Still, people risked it. Because here, to be known for beauty was to be feared, to be envied, and secretly, to be adored. Even if your garden didn't win the war, it might win a heart. Or at least a night worth remembering. You walk now through one such garden abandoned, overgrown but still breathing. The paths are cracked, the fountains dry, but the scents linger. A flash of sweetness here, a spike of spice there. You run your fingers along a wall etched with carvings of flowers and faces and intertwined hands. At the bottom, a single line in fading script. He asked me for peace, and I gave him perfume. That's it. No name. No outcome. Just proof that someone once tried to settle something not with a blade, but with beauty. And as you stand in the center of the broken courtyard, The wind picks up, lifting petals into the air like confetti or ashes. You realize the truth of this place. These were not gardens of leisure. They were declarations. Each bloom was a sentence. Each scent, a dare. Each perfectly placed leaf whispered, "We understand pleasure better than you ever will." And in a world where desire could make or break empires, that understanding was everything. The light shifts again, less gold now, more amber, warm and secretive. Like candlelight spilling through gauze. You're deeper in the palace gardens than you've ever been. And now the plants seem arranged less for beauty, more for privacy. Vines are trained to curtain doorways. Fountains gurgle just loud enough to muffle conversation. And the paths don't lead straight. They meander, twist, encourage you to get lost. And you get the feeling, very suddenly, that this is where the real games happen. Not the rituals, not the poetry. The politics. The seductions that didn't just tangle hearts. They rewrote alliances, rerouted power. Because this is where desire turned diplomatic. Where one night in a flowered pavilion could mean the difference between peace and annihilation. You've entered the diplomatic love groves. And every petal is a pawn. Here. Romance wasn't romance. It was currency. The Aztec Empire was stitched together from dozens of city-states, regions, and rival factions. And while battles played their part, the real glue was marriage. Not just formal unions either, but arranged liaisons, flirtations encouraged by priests, love letters approved by generals, moonlit strolls observed and recorded by emissaries. A well-placed kiss could prevent a rebellion. A steamy night behind a jasmine curtain could secure exclusive trade routes for generations. This was not soft power. It was scented, yes, but razor sharp, and often it was women who played the lead roles. Daughters of high-ranking nobles were trained not only in dance and language but in geopolitical strategy. They learned how to read body language, interpret flower codes, and flirt just enough to lure, never enough to commit. Unless commitment was the goal. And the men? Some were bait. Others were just lucky. But the most successful ones knew they were being handled and played along. Because the alternative was to be irrelevant. Historians still debate whether these romantic negotiations were formally recorded or passed through oral channels. But references show up in unlikely places: burial goods, priest logs, court poetry. One recovered scroll includes a line that reads, "Her touch soothed the ambassador's fury better than 10 envoys with parchment." Another he gifted her a bracelet of quetzal feathers. She gave him a border treaty signed in sweat. No one says these things outright, but everyone knows what they mean. Tonight's sex story is exactly one of these. It stars Tenochtitlan, flower of the lords, a woman of high status, known for her startling gray eyes and a voice like smoked honey. She wasn't married. She didn't have to be. Her presence at a negotiation table was enough to shift the outcome. In one historic case, the empire faced the threat of a coastal uprising. The rebel leader had refused every offer, insulted every emissary, even cursed Montezuma by name. Then Tenochtitlan was sent not as an envoy, but as a garden escort. She brought no threats, no gifts, just poetry. And a gift of salt shaped into a flower. The story goes that after 4 nights of conversation, 1 shared bath, and a single kiss exchanged at dawn, the rebellion melted. The man returned to the capital, married one of Tenochtitlan's cousins, signed over his territory. She never spoke of him again. But 2 weeks later, a new plant bloomed in her personal garden. No one else had ever seen it before. A sea lily with petals that curled like tongues. But this kind of diplomacy wasn't limited to noble women. Male courtiers, trained dancers, and even select eunuchs were sometimes deployed to soothe tensions through seduction. They weren't called lovers. They were rainmakers, those who softened hardened hearts and made conditions fertile for agreement. One scribe recorded a case where two enemy generals were brought into the same garden pavilion and, after a ritual performance by three young men in feathered veils, ended their feud. No one ever detailed what happened in that pavilion. But the next day, trade resumed. Coincidence? Please, here's your quirky tidbit for tonight. There was an actual position in the palace called Flower Keeper of the Western Garden. It sounds poetic, but the role's real function was tracking which flowers bloomed where and when, so the emperor or his advisors could plan diplomatic meetings around the scent profile most likely to influence mood. Sweet scents encouraged trust, spicy ones enhanced courage, bitter ones best avoided unless you wanted tension. One garden record shows a delegation meeting being rescheduled due to a mistimed magnolia bloom. The empire didn't leave diplomacy to chance. It left it to petals and gifts. Gifts weren't always gold or jade. One of the highest forms of flattery was a personalized flower arrangement, each bloom chosen for symbolic resonance. Want to ask for forgiveness? A bundle of crushed marigold, pale orchid, and one dying lily. Want to propose a political marriage? Red hibiscus, rainflower buds, and powdered rose stems folded into a leaf and hand-delivered before dawn. Some lovers even developed scent cycles, changing their perfumes throughout negotiations to guide the emotional flow. One noble woman reportedly opened her talks with smoke and citrus, moved the honeyed cacao by day 3, and sealed her terms with the scent of night jasmine soaked in sweat. The final clause? Accepted and unforgettable. These romantic diplomats didn't just operate in the capital. They traveled across valleys, rivers, borders. They were trained in languages, lullabies, even culinary seduction. One record notes a peace deal sealed not with a treaty, but with a shared meal under moonlight, featuring heartfruit, toasted maize, and a rare chocolate that made the mouth tingle. The diners? A rebellious warlord and the emperor's cousin. The dessert? Allegedly followed by an agreement of physical sincerity. We'll let your imagination handle the rest. But there was risk. These liaisons could backfire. One infamous scandal involved a love emissary who became too attached to her target. Instead of guiding him toward alliance, she helped him plan an escape. They vanished together for a year. When found, he was executed. She was not. Instead, she was placed in a temple as a listener. For 10 years, she was forbidden to speak, only to observe. It's said that when she finally spoke again, her first word was his name, carved into a flower. And even after conquest, the practice lingered. Spanish officials were baffled by the undercurrent of affection that seemed to accompany every serious meeting. Why were gifts wrapped in petals? Why were negotiations preceded by poetry or dancing? They called it soft superstition. They didn't understand that for the Aztecs, desire wasn't a distraction. It was the very mechanism of diplomacy. To be desired was to be seen, and to be seen was to be understood. If you could touch someone's heart, why bother threatening their army? You pause now beneath a carved stone trellis, where passion fruit vines have twisted themselves into a knot. The scent is overwhelming, sweet, fermented, alive. You think about all the kisses that rewrote maps, all the glances that dissolved armies, all the lovers who never meant to change history, but did, just by saying yes at the right moment, beneath the right flower, with the right moon looking on dot, because here, love didn't just happen. It was scheduled, designed, performed like an offering. And sometimes, that offering was so well crafted, so delicately irresistible, it changed the world. You almost don't notice the shift at first. The path narrows, the plants grow closer, and the air becomes thick with the kind of silence that feels curated, intentional. The wind hushes itself, the birds go quiet, and even your breath seems louder than it should be. Then you see it, the pale green of privacy curtains flapping like whispers, the stone benches curved too intimately for formal meetings, and the unmistakable outline of a gold-threaded hammock swaying gently, though there's no breeze. This isn't a public space, it's a secret, a kept promise, a risk. You've wandered behind the palace's last wall into the private court, where forbidden's love didn't just blossom. It burned. This was the emperor's blind spot, and his most dangerous playground. Because while Aztec society was ruled by strict boundaries between classes, castes, families, bloodlines, desire never cared. Love still found its way into the crevices. And sometimes it climbed palace walls, slipped through silk curtains, and whispered its name into ears that were never supposed to hear it. Forbidden's affairs weren't just accidents, they were revolutions in slow motion. And in the court of Montezuma, they were everywhere. There's a reason the gardens were so elaborate. The veils of vines, the overlapping scent trails, the soundproofed pavilions. These weren't just architectural flourishes. They were cover, tools, shields, affairs between nobles and courtesans, priestesses and scribes, dancers and diplomats. These weren't uncommon. They were a natural result of putting hundreds of beautiful, powerful, lonely people in one place and pretending rules would protect them from each other. The rules didn't stand a chance. Historians still argue how common these affairs were, and whether they were tolerated or punished. But coded references litter the records. There are poems that describe the stolen hour behind the reed curtain, carvings that show two hands meeting in a shadowed grove, and ceremonial songs that inexplicably shift from praise of the gods to descriptions of bodies pressed together in darkened chambers. One such song, performed during the Moon Festival, ends with a line that translates loosely to, "You wore another's name, but I wore your breath." Tonight's sex story is the kind that gets passed down in whispers. It's the tale of a high-ranking warrior named Tenochtitlan, Black Smoke, who fell for a palace attendant named Uxokiahuli, Flower Rain. She was responsible for preparing ceremonial robes, which meant her hands brushed the garments worn by gods, kings, and generals. That's how he noticed her, not during a ritual, not at a feast, but in a quiet moment when she adjusted the hem of his tunic and murmured. This thread was woven in fire. He didn't know what she meant. He followed her into the garden anyway. Their affair lasted 3 seasons. It was never public. But every time he returned from battle, she left a petal in his sandal. When he died speared during a border skirmish, she stitched his ashes into the lining of a cloak meant for Montezuma himself. The emperor wore it once, then returned it to her without a word. Some say he knew. Others say he didn't have to. But not all forbidden's loves were so poetic. Some were dangerous, manipulative, calculated. There were cases of commoners sneaking into noble compounds under the pretense of servitude, only to end up entangled with their betters. And yes, there were consequences. One court record details the public punishment of a scribe who dared romance the daughter of a high priest. He was given a choice: lose a hand or confess the affair to the gods during a moon rite. He chose confession. The temple reports say he walked into the ritual chamber. He never came out. His name was struck from the registry, but his poems still survived. Passed hand to hand, tucked into songbooks, carved behind water basins. One line reads, "She unthreaded me and wove herself into my ruin." Here's your quirky tidbit. The palace grounds had specific stones known as kissing markers. They weren't official, of course, but among the younger attendants and novice priestesses, it was said that if you kissed someone while standing on one of these stones, the gods would look away. It wasn't doctrine, it was folklore. But those stones always seemed to be slightly warmer than the others, and always suspiciously worn at lip height on the nearest wall. And of course, not all forbidden's affairs ended in poetry. Some ended in war. One infamous incident, known in fragments as the Night of Three Names, involved a secret affair between a visiting ambassador's son and Montezuma's niece. They were caught, Not together, but through the scent of her perfume on his tunic. She wore something rare, cactus bloom mixed with crushed firefly oil, unmistakable. The affair caused diplomatic chaos. Trade stalled. Envoys were detained. The lovers? Never punished publicly. But the niece was reassigned to a temple far outside the capital. The boy? Sent back with a letter he never opened. Later he was found with a ring made of dried petals said to match the ones from her garden. Neither married. No one spoke of it again, except in the ballads sung in that region for centuries, all ending with the same whispered line, "She smelled like rain slash and I drowned." These affairs weren't just gossip. They were politics in silk gloves. A noble who broke protocol for love might lose their title or gain a throne. Because sometimes forbidden love was strategic. A way to shift loyalties, reframe alliances, unseat rivals. A well-placed scandal could open a path that diplomacy couldn't. And in a palace this complex, every heart was a potential weapon. Or a liability. And yet, despite the risk, people kept falling, over and over. Because what's more Aztec than believing that love, like blood, should be offered to the gods? That passion isn't sacred in spite of its danger, but because of it. These weren't just affairs. They were acts of defiance, of belief, of hunger strong enough to carve secret paths through stone. You step now into one of those secret paths. Narrow, overgrown, barely wide enough for two bodies pressed close. The kind of place where whispers linger and kisses leave heat marks on the leaves. You see initials carved into bark, symbols etched into stone, petals crushed into the shape of names that no one says out loud anymore. And you realize you're not just walking through history. You're walking through confession. Through the remains of all those hearts that refused to behave. That dared. That touched what was not theirs. And in doing so, made it theirs anyway. Because in this empire, the most dangerous thing you could do was fall in love with someone you weren't supposed to. And the most powerful thing? Make them fall in love back. There's music drifting now, low and uneven, like someone plucking strings underwater. You follow it, but it keeps slipping between trees, over moss, beneath your feet. You pass a wall covered in names none complete, all faded, and finally come into a clearing where the grass is worn flat in a wide circle. This is where people came to remember what they'd lost. Not with shrines, with songs. Welcome to the Heartbreak Gardens. You've seen the flowers that made lovers swoon, the pavilions where desire tilted the scales of empire. But here is where it all came undone. The Aztecs weren't sentimental about love, but they weren't immune to it either. And when things broke, when desire turned sour, when lovers disappeared, when nights once scented with cinnamon and jasmine soured into silence, they didn't bury it. They sang it. This section of the palace gardens was unofficial, never mentioned. In court plans, never blessed by priests. But it existed. Maintained quietly by servants, respected silently by nobles. A place to go when your beloved married someone else, or was sacrificed, or simply stopped returning your glances. There are carvings here not of gods, but of hands. Letting go, faces turned away, lovers sleeping back to back. And among the flowers, strange ones grow small, pale things that smell like old books and burned honey. Plants that didn't bloom during joy, but afterward. Their nectar was bitter, their petals always half-closed. They were called Xochitl, flower that remembers the other flower. A botanical ache. Historians still argue whether these grief gardens were accepted cultural practice or quiet rebellion against a society that rarely allowed time for mourning romantic loss. But poems from the period are unmistakably clear. One reads, "My ribs are a flute you once blew. Ere through now the sound is missing." Another, "She braided my hair with silence and left me tangled." These were not the words of warriors boasting victories. These were the confessions of people who had loved and lost, and dared to admit it. Tonight's sex story is, for once, not about heat or conquest. It's about what comes after. It belongs to a man known only as Tenochtitlan, he who twists, a garden singer once favored by a priestess of high rank. Their love was considered improper, not because of class, but because she was already promised to the gods. Their affair lasted 2 years, sustained by night visits and notes left in flower beds. Then, during the Festival of Wind, she was called to her final vow: eternal silence, eternal separation. She followed through. He did not protest. But for the next decade, he visited this garden every new moon and sang one verse. Always different, always unfinished. He became part of the garden. When he died, the servants planted his favorite flower, a scentless lily known only to bloom where voices linger. It's still there. It doesn't smell like anything. But people swear it hums. These songs weren't public performances. They were murmured in corners, hummed during rituals, etched into fruit rinds, and tucked into offerings left at the foot of temple steps. Some songs were meant for the dead, others for the living who might as well have been. One particularly haunting line, carved into the side of a garden wall, reads, "You are not gone, only unreachable, like the first light behind my eyes." The wall has since crumbled. The line remains. Here's your quirky tidbit for tonight. There were professional mourning singers trained specifically to perform during the loss of romantic love. Not funerals, breakups, unconsummated desires, emotional betrayals. They'd be summoned with a fee of cacao or ceremonial beads, listen quietly to the story, then craft a verse to perform beneath a designated grief tree. Some were so skilled, their verses became household proverbs. One such singer, called Smoke Voice, was known for turning sorrow into something so beautiful it made rivals cry. One of her most famous verses, "You gave me laughter with a sharp edge, now I bleed where I once smiled." People recited it for years, not because they knew her, but because they'd lived it. And sometimes, the heartbreak wasn't from a lover's betrayal. Sometimes it came from rules, from obligations, from choices that had no good outcome. One preserved poem tells of a woman who left her lover because her family needed a marriage alliance. She wrote him a goodbye verse painted in blue ink on a piece of cloth. The ink was made from crushed cornflowers and salt. The words read, "My body walks toward him, but my shadow waits with you." The cloth was never found, but the poem? Still sung during planting season, when the cornflowers bloom again. Even the gods, it seems, understood heartbreak. Myths abound of divine lovers separated by duty, jealousy, or death. One of the most famous tells of Quetzal, goddess of love, who was once stolen away by a jealous god and forbidden to return to her true consort. Every year, on the same day, she's said to appear in the form of a butterfly near the gardens where they used to meet. If you see her and speak her name, she whisper the name of the person you've never stopped loving. But only if you're alone, and only if you're ready to hear it. Some heartbreak was transformed into ritual. During the Feast of Falling Petals, couples who had ended their bond were encouraged to meet in the grief gardens one last time. Not to argue, not to rekindle, just to walk, in silence, through the same paths they once walked in joy. It was believed. This final circuit helped release the memory without bitterness. One noble woman, according to records, completed the walk every year on the anniversary of her first lover's disappearance. She wore the same flower every time a wilted rain, lily tucked behind her ear. She never remarried, but her garden produced the brightest blooms in the region. You stand now beside a tree whose bark is scarred with names most incomplete, some crossed out. Beneath it, a bench with grooves worn smooth from years of elbows and backs and shoulders. Slumped in resignation, you sit, just for a moment, and you feel the echoes settle around you. They're not sad, exactly. just present. Like these stories want you to remember that desire doesn't always lead to triumph. Sometimes it leads to silence, to absence, to the long, slow ache of what might have been. And yet, the garden keeps growing, because even heartbreak was sacred here, even longing without end. The Aztecs didn't erase grief. They folded it into the petals, let it soak the soil, so that new desire, when it bloomed, would carry the scent of everything that came before. Not as burden, as memory, as truth. You rise slowly, your feet brushing a trail of fallen petals that weren't there before. Or maybe they always were. You don't know. All you know is that this part of the garden didn't try to fix anything. It just witnessed. And sometimes, that's all love ever needed. The first thing you feel is absence. The air has changed sharper, thinner, like it's been scraped clean. The flowers are still here, but they bloom quieter now, subdued in shape and color. It's as if the garden is holding its breath. You take a few cautious steps forward, through rows of pale blossoms with stems cut too short, petals pressed flat, as if trained to behave. The wind brings no perfume, only dust. You've crossed a line, and the garden knows it. This is not an Aztec garden anymore, not really. This is what survived the Spanish, or tried to. And this section bleeds silence. When the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century, they didn't just bring disease, guns, and steel. They brought a theology that was terrified of bodies. A worldview that saw physical pleasure as sin, that demanded every flower of the flesh be plucked and burned. And in their minds, the Aztec love gardens were not sacred. They were Satan's playground. Courtyards dedicated to desire, abomination, rituals involving sensuality, heresy, priests with perfume-stained hands and hymns laced with longing. Unacceptable. They didn't try to understand. They tried to erase. Historians still debate the scale of the destruction. Some argue that entire libraries of erotic poetry and medical herbology were burned. Others believe the worst losses weren't the texts, but the practices, the casual, everyday rituals that didn't leave records, but shaped everything from conversation to clothing to courtship. One friar, horrified by the fragrant devilry he witnessed, ordered the public burning of perfumes and ritual flowers in the heart of Tenochtitlan. Witnesses say the smoke smelled like funerals and cinnamon. For weeks after, lovers left blank petals in each other's beds. A silent protest. A memory. Tonight's sex story takes place on that threshold, between the old world and the one being forced into place. It follows a woman named Yaudiolovla, Heart of War, who served as a priestess and keeper of the southern desire garden. When the missionaries arrived, she was one of the first to be interrogated, not for her faith, but for her knowledge. She knew too much about plants, about pleasure, about power that didn't require conquest. They demanded she confess her sins. She offered a list of flowers. They demanded she burn her robes. She wore them anyway. One day, she was found singing softly in Nahuatl while grinding orchid root in a stone bowl. They tried to stop her. She did not resist. But when they looked in the bowl, the root had turned red. She said, even crushed, it remembers. She was never seen again. But after that day, red orchids began growing near the convent walls. No one ever claimed responsibility that the Spanish didn't just criminalize the body. They redefined it. Where once desire had been layered with metaphor, ceremony, and ecological knowledge, now it was stripped bare and nailed to sin. The intricate etiquette of the love gardens was dismissed as superstition. The goddesses of fertility and joy were renamed demons. And worst of all, the people who carried that knowledge were punished, converted, silenced, or executed. Entire generations grew up fearing what their ancestors had honored. Here's your quirky tidbit. One of the ways colonial friars tried to erase erotic tradition was through smell. They mandated cleansing scents for temples and homes, usually bitter. Herbs like rue or pungent smoke like sulfur, to override the floral perfumes once used in intimacy rites. The result? People began associating pleasure with shame. Rooms, once scented with wild vanilla and flower resin, were overtaken by medicinal stench. And yet, some resisted, in secret, under layers of incense. A few clever attendants developed blends that smelled acceptable at first, but bloomed into something sultry after heating. The scent of resistance. Despite their efforts, the missionaries couldn't erase everything. People remembered. They passed knowledge in lullabies, kitchen songs, market jokes. Instead of codices, they used embroidery. Instead of rituals, they used recipes. Grandmothers whispered flower names as blessings. Lovers traced petal shapes on skin. And the gardens themselves? Some were raised, but others simply shifted, became smaller, less obvious. Hidden in courtyards, behind kitchens, beneath cloisters. Private spaces where the old ways were honored in silence. Where a single orchid growing where no one planted, it meant someone still remembered. And some things the Spanish couldn't even recognize, let alone suppress. Like the poetic double meanings embedded in Nahuatl, the language itself was a hiding place. One word could mean rain, sorrow, or desire, depending on the rhythm. Entire love poems disguised as prayers. One such poem, recorded in a friar's notebook with a confused margin note, reads, "She poured water into my mouth, and I forgot the drought." He translated it as an agricultural blessing. But anyone who's ever been kissed knows better. And sometimes, resistance took bolder forms. There are scattered reports always dismissed as legend of shadow rituals carried out during eclipses or stormy nights. Former priestesses would lead small gatherings into abandoned gardens, carrying bundles of dried petals and candle stubs. They'd recite forgotten verses, smear perfume on their wrists, and share touches not permitted by law or priest. Were these ceremonies real? No official record confirms them. But folk songs still mention the midnight blooming and hands beneath the hibiscus moon, and the plants still grow there. Even under conquest, desire finds cracks to bloom. You walk now through a garden that's trying to forget itself. The fountains are dry, the vines trimmed into obedience. The colors bleached, but here and there defiance. A bloom too red, a perfume too sweet, a shadow that doesn't match its tree. Someone's been tending it, quietly, lovingly, illegally, and then you see it, carved into the back of a stone bench, hidden by ivy. A line in looping script. You cannot conquer what refuses to blush. It's not ancient, but it's not new either. Someone added it in the last few decades. A gardener, perhaps. A descendant, a believer. It's not defiant, just stubborn. And deeply, irreversibly Aztec. Because the love gardens were never just about sex. They were about connection. About offering. About recognizing beauty as power. And intimacy as knowledge. And while swords can cut flowers, they can't kill their roots. Those roots wait. They survive under stone. They bloom when no one's looking. You leave this section with a strange ache. Not sadness exactly, just recognition. Of what was lost. Of what wasn't. Of how a whole empire could be burned. And yet somehow, a single petal still holds its scent. That scent follows you now. Clinging to your clothes, your skin, your memory. You won't forget it. And maybe that's the whole point. You suddenly feel the ground tremble under your sandals. Soft vibrations rolling through the stones like a buried heartbeat waking up. The evening air warps hot now, electric, humming with something unseen. Ahead, a grotto carved from obsidian appears, walls polished smooth. Dripping water soft against the rock in random patterns that sound like whispered breath. You're stepping into a subterranean secret garden, once hidden beneath the palace, accessible only to those who knew the tunnels. It's no longer about petals or poetry. It's about the roots, the memory, the spirit of desire throttled and buried, now rising, because this buried garden never died. It just sleeps, and waking it will change everything. Deep beneath the surface, these tunnels connected chambers of ritual, herb storage, and secret meetings. But in the darkest season, when conquest sacked the city and priests burned codices as if erasing the world's mind, some caretakers carried away cuttings, seeds, verses, burying them here, in secret soil, in secret memory. When they died, the garden grew its own guardians, roots that threaded through stone, flowers that burst through cracks in moonlight, petals that smelled like nostalgia and salt. You're standing where seeds survived silence. Historians still question whether these subterranean gardens were deliberate sanctuaries or tumbled side effects of ruin. But the plants themselves tell the story. Blue orchids with veins like whispered names. A vine that blooms once every full moon and retracts when standing torches are lit. A flower that opens only when someone recites poems in Nahuatl. These aren't folklore, they're phenotype. Evidence that someone planted resistance. Deep down, because sometimes the most dangerous act of all is persistence. Tonight's sex story belongs to a midwife and herbalist named Quetzali, Precious Feather, one of the last women initiated as a flower priestess in Tenochtitlan. When the Spaniards dismantled the temples, she fled underground, carrying with her an obsidian knife, handfuls of seed pods, and a scroll of poems hidden inside a woven mat. She made her home in this grotto. There, she held ceremonies by torchlight, whispering verses over soil, lighting incense over petals, and preparing elixirs to keep memory alive. Lovers came to her, escaped nobles, scribes, even commoners burning with longing. She tended them, named them, healed them, and sometimes ... She bound them together. One case is recorded in oral tradition. A young guard and a flower vendor, separated by rank and religion. Quetzali approved their bond, placed a vow potion in their palms, braided hibiscus petals in their hair, and let them leave together at dawn, never to return. They created a new lineage tracked only in memory. Descendants still call their home the House of Two Blooms. And here's that quirky detail to keep you hooked. Some of the underground blossoms are geoluminescent, tiny luminescent petals that glow when touched. Not chemical, but biological, pollinated by cave moths with phosphorescent patterns. The effect? Lovers wandering in darkness and finding each other, guided by petals lighting like stars underfoot. It's rumored Quetzali cultivated them intentionally as living co-conspirators. Imagine seduction illuminated by plants, literally glowing beneath your feet. Quetzali's rituals weren't just erotic, they were spells of memory. If someone forgot, she planted a kernel in their palm. If they doubted beauty, she pressed a petal to their tongue. If their lover died, she sang into the earth until flowers grew from grief. She called these rites echo ceremonies, acts meant to replay history into new bloom. And they worked. People emerged from the grotto changed. Eyes brighter, gait lighter, a scent lingering they couldn't name. The garden didn't just survive, it resurrected the desire, aesthetics of an entire culture. Most missionaries couldn't fathom this. To them, plants were weeds, women were sinners, and gardens without priests were empty pits. But they didn't get to this place. They didn't descend. They didn't plant. They didn't bleed seeds. So they never observed the flowers that only bloomed for forbidden lovers, or heard the petals thrumming with nocturnal verse. For them, the world ended at the palace floor. But the truth was deeper. You lean forward and touch a petal, it shimmers. A bead of dew forms, shaped like a tear. You don't wipe it, because you realize what this is. A garden of remembrance, a botanical archive of loss and longings. Each flower is a story, each bloom a confession. And the air inside the grotto tastes of iron and nostalgia and sweat, raw, powerful. Make love here? Don't ask. It's less about sex, more about consecration of desire itself. A final offering, and yet this buried beauty isn't static. The garden pulses in its own rhythm, testing the surface. Every once in a while, a vine pushes through cracks. A single blossom drips into the courtyard above. Someone notices. Someone remembers. And quietly, that flower is kept, preserved, passed on. The garden leaks. In secret networks of guardians, mothers, botanists, lovers, poets. There are rumors of a few quiet rituals still held in the tunnels. Lovers bound by genealogy rather than politics. Heirs of Aztec cities choosing moonlit vows here, saying lines stolen from old codices. One report mentions a ceremony in 1692, where descendants of a courtesan brushed petals between their fingers and recited, "We bloom in breath, stolen from the past." It was kept out of the official church records, but villagers still sing versions of the chant on moonless nights. Even now, the glow blossoms persist, flowers not catalogued in any botanical list. Pollination patterns unknown to science, yet they thrive. And when the surface gardens lose their scent, when monuments crack and memory falters, beneath it all this garden keeps pulsing. Because roots don't stop when you cut them, they adapt. They survive underground. You sit, wrapped in dim light, letting the silence hum. The petals glow softly under your palm. You close your eyes, and you feel it, not just history, but intention. Someone wanted this. Someone planted beauty as resistance. Teach desire as wisdom, and love as continuity. You rise at last, tracing your finger along a carving in the grotto wall. A double flower with one root, flowering above and below ground. Below it, a single word, quali good. In this context, not social good. Moral good. Memories good. Persistence is good. You step back into the path, and for a moment, the garden above seems different, its fragrance more distant, its flowers shallower. Because you've touched something elemental, something unerasable. A garden that refused to be erased. A desire that refused to die. And now that you've been here, the garden will hold your memory too. There's a final turn in the path you haven't taken yet, subtle, narrow, partially overgrown, as if it doesn't want to be found too easily. You step into it, and the garden doesn't open into another plaza or shrine or chamber. It opens into sky. You're outside the palace walls now, barefoot on soft soil under open stars. But it doesn't feel exposed. It feels infinite. Here, the air smells of damp earth and something older than incense or perfume. You realize slowly that you've arrived not at a monument or a ruin, but at a return. This is ancestral ground, soil that remembers feet before roads, names before borders. And you're not here to visit it. You're here to be claimed by it. Your eyes adjust and you see small torches flickering among the underbrush. Not ceremonial, intimate. Placed with care around stones that form the rough circle of a long-forgotten meeting grove. No priests. No soldiers. Just breath and body. Lovers have stood here. Met here. Waited in silence for someone brave enough to step through leaves and join them. It's not a place of public vows. It's a threshold. A space between memory and dream, between survival and surrender. And now, between the past and you, this place is where the love gardens began, not in palaces but in breath, in skin, in the first hush after a kiss, before the empires, before the laws, before someone decided who was worthy of what. This was where flowers meant desire, not decoration. Where scent meant truth, not luxury. Where being seen wasn't political, it was holy. And no one needed permission. The final sex story tonight is the one you've been writing all along. Yours. Because after everything, the incense, the poems, the perfumed hands, the garden so careful they whispered, you're here, alive, curious, moved by something ancient, Enough to reach through centuries of conquest and caution and still touch your chest from the inside. Your heart is responding not to nostalgia, but to recognition. This was never a story about the Aztecs alone. It's a story about what it means to want, to bloom, to risk tenderness in a world sharpened by war and expectation. And here's your final quirky detail. In the old tongue, the word for pleasure was a compound of to open and to return. Not just the joy of the moment, but the act of returning to openness, like a flower, like a memory, like you, standing in this field, breathing the air of a world that once dared to make gardens out of desire itself. Historians still debate whether the love gardens were primarily religious, therapeutic, economic, or erotic. But the people who tended them never asked. For them, there was no difference. Beauty was duty, desire was knowledge, and every petal that opened was a kind of prayer. The gardens were sacred not because they were fenced off from life, but because they made life feel more vivid, more full, more felt. You close your eyes now and let it all come back. The song in the marketplace, the kiss behind the reed curtain, the red orchid braided into a warrior's hair, the coated petal left on a sandal strap, the line whispered, "In the waddle, I wore your breath," the perfume stitched into a robe, the poetry smuggled into recipe books, the hands held over flickering flowers, the memory of being wanted, the hope that desire might still be sacred. Even now, you stand barefoot. You breathe deep. You feel your pulse slow. You let the garden take you in not as a guest, but as kin. Because if you've followed this path all the way here, past blood and conquest, through longing and laughter, past whispers and exile and return, then the garden doesn't just belong to the Aztecs anymore. It belongs to everyone brave enough to bloom. And now gently we wind down. Let the imagery soften. The flowers fade, the drums grow quiet, and the candle smoke curls up into the sky, dissolving like a sigh you didn't know you were holding. You've walked a long way through gardens, carved by love, grief, rebellion, pleasure, and memory, through scent and stone and story. You've held petals in your palm, traced poetry across centuries, and maybe, just maybe, felt something ancient tug quietly at the roots of your heart. Whatever you carried into this journey, let it rest now. Let the earth hold it for you. Because that's what the Aztec gardens always knew. That beauty was not escape. It was offering. It was presence. And desire, that was never shameful. It was survival. You breathe slower now. The night hums soft around you. The stars blink above, patient and steady. Maybe you remember a scent, a face, a line from a verse that slipped between your ribs and hasn't left. Let it stay. Let it bloom. The story is over, but the garden keeps growing. End of script. Sweet dreams.